My name is John Witvliet. I'm director of the Worship Institute at Calvin, and it is a great honor for me to welcome our two panelists today. Cheryl Bear, to my far right here, comes from Vancouver, British Columbia. She is her second-time guest with us at the Worship Symposium. Artist, singer, songwriter, educator, a person who has traveled more than almost anyone I know, which is saying something.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm thinking of all of the visits that you have done to how many different First Nations communities throughout Canada. How many would you guess it is?
In the U.S., over 600.
Over 600 out of the 1,000. So a person with exceptional knowledge of place, of her own, and then through these journeys of learning and discovery. I'm so grateful, Cheryl, that you're back with us.
Thanks, John.
And then it's a great honor to welcome to Calvin this week Reverend Najla Kassab from Beirut, Lebanon. Honor to have you here. She is the current president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. She probably is just passing Cheryl Bear this year in terms of amount of total travel of all of our symposium speakers. Yeah. Reverend Kassab travels widely in her role now as president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, but also speaks so poignantly about ministry in her place, and it's been an honor to have her on campus as our January series speaker, Staub lecturer this year, and now also weaving in through the discussions here at the Worship Symposium. Conversations about worship and culture have been central in our work over these past many years. And one of the important things that we hope happens at this conference is that every single one of us realizes that we are enculturated beings, that we all are shaped by a particular cultural context, that contextualized worship is something we all practice. And the questions then around worship and culture are how do we honor the gifts that God has given to the communities and cultures in which God has placed us as individuals? So there's an appreciation and honoring. How do we appropriately, winsomely, firmly have also a countercultural stance to aspects of our local cultural context that are opposed to what the gospel calls us to, that we relish and savor opportunities for cross-cultural encounter, that we wake up every day and we are thrilled about a conversation just like this. Actually, I'm actually so excited about a conversation like this, that we cannot wait to learn from our brothers and sisters in parts of the body of Christ in cultures different from our own. And that we also then learn to relish those things that we hold in common, those transcultural practices that are shared widely across Christian communities. The talking points I've just recited are beautifully summarized in a gift to us from the Lutheran World Federation called the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture. It's an invitation for worship in every time and place to be transcultural, contextual, countercultural, cross-cultural. Oh, but it is so much better to treat this not just in the form of an abstract theory, but to actually do this conversation in terms of learning from each other. And so I'm going to ask both Najla and Cheryl to share a bit of their own story, if you would. And perhaps, Najla, I could ask you to go first, and then Cheryl, and we'll kind of go back and forth here. Telling us a bit about your story, describing worship in your home context, and reflecting on what are the parts of those worship practices that are exceptionally contextual, and where are the places that are countercultural in your practice. So take us to Beirut, would you, Najla?
Yes. Thank you. Not in these days, it's hard to take you to Beirut. The situation is difficult. First, thank you. I think this week has been very enriching for me in my task in the Middle East or worldwide about reflecting on worship. And before I start speaking about Beirut, I want to say something very special happened with the World Communion of Reformed Churches. As a president, I usually lead the meetings, and we have adopted what's called consensus model, which is when we have issues to talk about, we don't go through mere voting. We go through discussions and worship. So what the decisions are put in a setting of worship, because at the end we are a church as a communion, and what we do needs to reflect the image of Christ in everything. So this is a new shift that happened in our organization as World Communion of Reformed Churches, and we apply it in our meetings, and many of our churches are applying that in their meetings, where the discussions are wrapped with spirituality, with worship, and it has been healthy and very enriching. I come to Beirut, to Lebanon. I'm Presbyterian, and in 1823, the mission started forming the presence of the Presbyterian Church. It's said if you want to describe your worship in a word, we worship, we are aliens at home. Because with the beauty that the missionaries did, and it's not a matter to say if they've done right or wrong. For sure, the understanding of mission has changed in the world, because missionaries came, and for sure they shared the gospel, and that's very important, but the gospel was not baptized with our context of worship. So our services are mainly like your services here. Well, if we travel around the world, that's good, because I can go to all churches and I sing the same hymns and in some way. But on the other side, we have lost the cultural element in our worship. And that's a big challenge. How do we really retain our culture, especially because many people think that if we change, we are not being faithful to the Reformed heritage. And how to incorporate that. And the young people are the ones who really challenge us on that. In another session, we were talking about how do we, share with our neighbors, the gospel or worship. When our neighbors come from a very Middle Eastern setting, you invite them to church and they feel like they are in a Western setting. And that affects this relation in reaching out to them. So I think at this stage, this is a big challenge that we have first to be enriched by other worship, elements from the Middle East. I think we have lots of rich worship in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Even, reaching out with Islam, hearing the music and all that. So we have to contextualize our worship. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge the older generation feel like, you are deviating from the roots. The younger generation says, it doesn't speak much to me. One of my professors, systematic theology, he used to tell me, and he's a musician, he said, Najla, we've been here since 1823. Don't you think people are, they got used to all this music, Western music? I said, not when they hear the drum, It is this challenge to really bring our culture more into our worship and to have something in between. I think the richness of what we were given as a church, and besides how we can reform it. And this is the challenge of reforming worship. At the end, it's how we can speak to people's hearts and minds and sit together to hear what God wants from us through these moments of worship.
No, John had like 5 questions.
Yes.
Did you answer all of them?
No, I did that.
Because I don't want to. I was like, how many questions of John's can I get away with answering? Because there was like 6, right? I remember half of one, so I'll give it my best shot. I actually brought something I should show you. I'm going to be singing later at the 3 p.m. Vespers. I sang yesterday, if you caught that one yesterday. But I have a rattle that was given to me by my cousin Serena. She made this, and it's I already broke it a little bit, but it just needs a little bit of glue. But she put a bear on this side, and then on this other side she put a bear paw. And this is usually made from the intestines of an animal, and it makes just a beautiful sound. So she did a great job. Anyway, my cousin Serena from Najla, I'm from Najla Wet'en First Nation. It's about an hour and a half west of Prince George in the middle of BC, British Columbia, Canada. I heard that. I'm not alone. Just kidding. My cousin Serena is tiny. I'm about 5'5", and she's like maybe up to my shoulder. She's always been tiny. I've known her, of course, all my life. And she lived across the river, which we always just called a cross. And so my grandpa's little blue house, where I spent about half my childhood, then you go across the bridge and then up, and she just lives right there. And she was a little girl. Her and I were really close, and then now we're really close. We're still really close. So she made me this, and she also is. She'll like take down a moose almost every season, and she'll sit and clean that whole moose, and take some, put it in her freezer. Can some, make moose stew, give it out to the relatives. I always get a big jar of canned moose stew. And then she'll also, during the salmon run, she will pull out, like salmon run is like maybe 4 and a bit weeks in Najla, and when it's a good salmon run, and she'll pull out about 1,000 salmon out of the Najla River. And there's also my cousin Gilbert. He will also pull out about that many. And that's probably the most, unless you have folks who are using a net, but they just use a fishing rod. So you have an idea of how much work she would have to do in order to do that. So, and this rattle, she also found time to make this rattle. And we have, over the last bunch of years in Najla, we have started relearning our songs. Somebody found a tape cassette of one of our former hereditary chiefs, one of our late hereditary chiefs named Maxine George, and he was singing all of these songs in our language, and he sang our Bear Clan song and different ones, and so we've learned these, and now it's vibrant. All the kids know how to sing the songs. We have maybe a 30-person. Everyone has hand drums, and we have the singers, and then we have the dancers, and there's like maybe 40 people who are the dancers in our. They're all youth, and it's beautiful. And there's been that revitalization of language and culture within my Indigenous community, and it's a tremendously good thing. And it's been it's taken everything we've got to get there because the policy of Canada, the Canadian government, was not to encourage that thing. They outlawed religious, spiritual practices, our not only our ceremonies, but our government practices, which was the potlatch. The church and the government partnered with the residential schools that were started in the United States called Indian boarding schools, and called all of this stuff evil, all of it. And one time I opened with a prayer song at one school I was teaching at, and I said, "Oh, by the way, I was told that my drum releases evil spirits, so I'm sorry about that. I should have given you a heads up. You weren't expecting that today in Bible school." But that's sort of the stuff that's talked about. Our instruments are always suspicious. Always, it's a little bit scary. It's a little bit off, and that's because we haven't been in charge of writing our own story. The Canadian and American governments have, from the time that Europeans landed on our shores, have controlled that story, have controlled the narrative. And we've either been written up as generalization, but dumb or scary. And so those two things come into our worship. When you, so I was raised as an Indigenous person, not really a part of the culture, not really knowing much about the potlatch, not knowing anything about our songs. I knew a little bit about powwow culture, but mostly just from TV and stuff, because we were essentially, well, very close to the land, like traditional life of, I knew how to clean a fish when I was a little kid, and then cleaned hundreds of fish by the time I was double digits. By the time I was 10 years old, I knew I cleaned hundreds of fish, right? So I knew that kind of a life, and was close to my grandpa, and the land, even though we lived in the town, or an hour and a half away. But the assimilation and colonization had been happening and had threatened to just, almost like a tsunami, just like kind of sweep us, just hit us and decimate us, and then sweep us away from the land and from the culture, and the devastation that would bring. And it was close. It was really close. But fortunately, we gained a lot of that back. But as a Christian, I had this in my mind. I lived this double life. I could have been a good, CIA. I don't know. I watched Born Identity, so I got questions about the CIA. Anyway, but but I could have made a good double agent. That sounds bad. But anyway, because I loved going to church. I became a Christian when I was 8. I loved church. Really loved God. Thrilled about Jesus, mostly after I read C.S. Lewis's Chronicle of Narnia, because that Jesus was kind of more cool than the scary one that I got saved under, and was trying to send me to hell every time I sinned. But so Aslan was cool. And then, so I loved that. I really wanted to be a good Christian. But at the same time, nothing about my nativeness was allowed in the church. So I would go into churches, and I use these 2 examples everywhere I talk. That one lady came up to me, and she's like, and of course I always had dark hair, and not anymore, but I was always kind of the brown person in a sea of white people in the church there. And one lady came up to me, and she said, "You're native, right?" I was like 14 or something. And I said, "Yeah, I'm from Najla." I was always very proud to tell people where I was from, even though I knew that their face would change. And hers did. She got very pensive, and she crossed her arms, and she said, because when I said I'm from Najla, she goes, "There's a lot of darkness in your community, isn't there?" And I'm a kid, right? I have no clue. I just about swore. We're on camera. But I have no clue, what the theological ramifications of that question. But I wish I could go back in time when she says there's a lot of darkness in your community. I wish I could now go back in time into my 14-year-old self and say, yes, at night. Because that's the truth. It's like that's how people assume so much about Indigenous land. You're going to cross onto the res and you're suddenly in darkness, right? And it's just not fair. Another thing that I did was I walked in with some native earrings, just some simple beaded ones, the ones that you automatically think about, like at the gift shop kind of thing. And then a lady came up to me in church again, different lady, same church, said, "Those are native earrings, right?" And I said, "Yes." And I was really proud, "Hey, cool, you noticed my earrings. I feel pretty." And then, but she didn't follow up with that. She followed up with, "Don't those have evil spirits?" And again, I felt like, okay, this now, and I learned some things from those experiences that I needed to walk into that church, especially the church. But lots of educational, my elementary school, my high schools, any other place. And I needed to hang up my identity like an unwanted winter jacket and leave it at the front and just try to ride under the radar and just try to not attract any attention. If I was asked, of course I was going to say, yes, I'm from Najla. But I didn't want to attract the racism.
So troubling, and a pattern that repeats itself in so many parts of the world, in so many ways, that has become, I think, even more vivid to me just in these last few days again, right, with conversations here with folks from all over the world. Maybe even before we would go on to different some of the other questions I'd sent, I could just ask briefly, as you think about your travels throughout your region, think about the range, because what a range there is of Christian churches in Beirut, and what a range of Christian expressions there would be, not in many of the places, Cheryl, that you've visited, and what range of approaches to culture would you find, even if it's just a couple examples to kind of unpack the range. I think that's the one danger we have in a conference like this is thinking we've met one person from one culture and then we have that sort of figured out, and not understanding the huge diversity within their world. So if you could take us into that just a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in the Middle East, we are a minority. And I tell you, in worship, we're not the strong ones. The Catholic and the Orthodox have wonderful worship in that. And, at the beginning, at some time, there were stronger walls between churches. Like you Reformed, you don't use any of the hymns from the other church or any expressions, and even, from other religions. Now things have changed because the relations are different between churches. And because, I discovered the richness from the Middle Eastern identity that's found in the Orthodox and in the Catholic Church. And how to be enriched by all this, to how to have worship beyond walls, like the way, have doctors beyond borders. Yeah, to be able to be in the presence of God and try to be enriched from this variety. This takes, I think, spiritual maturity to be able to see how God is speaking with us. Out of my ecumenical relations, I remember I used to go and pray with sisters, the nuns, who were my friends. And, at that time, they will not give communion to anybody who's not Catholic. I know the priest would come and we would sit and just to read the Bible and pray together. And the priest would say, Najla, come have communion with us. Don't think of regulations.
Nice.
Yeah. So we were in the presence of God, and we had a special way of worship. And interestingly, 1 month before, I was in a meeting, and I knew that usually the Catholic don't give communion to Protestants. And here we are in this meeting, and all of a sudden they call everybody, and they were giving us. And I said, that's new to me. And they said, we are serving together, we are working together. Why do we need to have these limits between each other? To be enriched, I think this is something that, especially as a small church in the Middle East, this is something very valuable. And to trust that God is working through all these churches, and probably we need to learn from them about, enculturation, how our worship is more. And at the same time, we're not compromising the gospel in all that we're doing, but it's the expression that we need to baptize it in our culture in that. Going around changes us, being exposed to different ways. I go to, not only in the Middle East, I go to Africa and see the richness of worship, to see the role of the young people in worship. I think that's very powerful. And to learn, because God's still working in our churches and working in other contexts for that.
So many different cultures within indigenous communities, Canada and the United States. Our nations, we consider ourselves sovereign nations, and if you drive onto the Navajo reservation, or we would say First Nations community in Canada, but if you drive onto there, it'll say you are now entering the sovereign Navajo nation. And so there's so many different contexts. There are hundreds of languages. In BC alone, there's a couple hundred languages. Because our people are separated by all these mountains. And in those places, there's a lot of different ways of being. Like I said, there's the powwow culture, there's the potlatch culture, and then there's, of course, pueblos in the south, and then you have longhouses in the east, and you have all of these different ways of being. In every single indigenous language and language group, there is a name, a story, a description of the creator and of the creation story. And I always get pushback on everything and anything I do as an Indigenous person, on anything that I think about as an Indigenous person in an Indigenous philosophy. I get pushback from church people in my life. And I've heard lots of different questions. Some are good, some are helpful, some are not. So one of the things about pushback, I heard a song, and the song was called Gichi Manadu, and it was by, I lost his name now, but anyway, and I was talking with someone, and then this Christian pastor, he said, oh, that's a false god. You can't use that name. You can't talk about that's, and just kind of like, let's just take this idea and just throw it away. And so I thought, okay. And so I started studying theology, and one of my profs said, how do we know that our God is the one true God? And I was like, good question. Let's hear it, sir. And he said, we know based on God's characteristics, attributes, so personality traits, and God does not act outside of those things. So so when we see like Baal or Molech, we're like, oh, that's not God, right? God would never ask that. When we see the Abraham story, Abraham and Isaac, and God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, that was actually the cultural norm of the day. That was the normalest thing that could happen to a family. They sacrificed children for their cities, right? So to us, we read this and we need a fainting couch to hear these stories because they're so dramatic. We're like, oh my goodness, how could God ask that? But that would have been like, oh yeah, and that's why they're both marching up there. Isaac is a young man. He's a young adult. He's not a little kid. He's willing because he knows the culture. The countercultural thing where we see God's hand is when God says stop. And that's when everybody goes, that's when everybody would lose their minds in the ancient church. We lose it earlier on, but so this is who God is. So I start asking questions of elders, and you cannot ask Indigenous elders, Bible school debate style questions. What about this? Well, you just said this. So what about that? You have to just actually say, can you tell me the story? And then you have to listen, and you have to absolutely be quiet, or you're going to get nowhere. They'll just be like, I've got to go and get a tea or something, because it's not native way to have a lot of questions. So I listened to a lot of elders and got the name and the story of a lot of different nations. And it was beautiful because the stories sounded quite similar, that the Creator started everything, the Creator made everything, the Creator watches over everything, the Creator hears our prayers. We have to give the utmost honor to the Creator. And all these different names for the Creator are just beautiful. The great mystery, Wakanta Kanta Kanshala, the grandfather, the ancient one. In my language, it's Yudagi, which means the being up on high. When we see a sign from the Creator, we're not supposed to talk. We're not supposed to say the name. Like, hey, look, there's the Creator. There's a sign. We're supposed to, get the attention silently, and because the Creator deserves so much respect, you're not even supposed to speak, about the signs of the Creator. It's very much like the Old Testament. So this view of God is very much an Old Testament view of God, very beautiful, and with a lot of signs and a lot to do with the land. And it's very earthy. Very general revelation, if you will. And so I, in the different contexts that I've been in, some of the most beautiful things that I've seen have been where the people, like for instance, this rattle has come from wood, the cedar or a birch branch, maybe pine, spruce is a lot of where we're from, and of course the inside of an animal, and then the fur of the animal, and then the leather, the hide. And then different beads. All of these everything here that my cousin put together. And then she's got sinew. It's a red sinew that she used to wrap this with. So it's all, there's a nail there, sorry. It's not very natural. But anyway, it's mostly all natural stuff. And my favorite times are when I go into a community and I see where the gospel has been contextualized. That is a beautiful thing to me. One of my profs, Rick Watts, at Regent College, when he was at Regent College, said, he's talking about his context in Australia, the Indigenous people of Australia, and he said, if Indigenous people don't understand Jesus within their worldview, do they ever truly become Christians at all? That's so powerful to me. I thought, oh my goodness. And then somebody else said, when the gospel has taken root in a culture, when the people start writing their own songs. So I've been in California and heard the bird singers in church. And it's the men that hold the rattles, and they have rounder ones. And they kind of have that kind of a sound. And then they do this beautiful dance where the men and the women kind of move like this, and it's so beautiful. And they'll do that sometimes in worship. And when you have a bunch of drums, hand drums, or you have guys sitting around, we have I don't know if you guys have heard about Jonathan Miracle. He's a Mohawk from Tyendinaga territory, near just east of Toronto, a couple hours in Vancouver, or in Canada. And he has a bunch of he's written a whole bunch of drum songs. The first time I ever heard a Native person using our language and our instruments, the rattle and the drum, was Jonathan, a song called Gonarunkwa. And I was just floored because I was in my 20s or something. So in those contexts, that gives me life to see that. I'm going to tell one quick, sorry, I'll try to make it quick, but when I first met Richard Twiss, and I hope if any of you don't know that name, I hope you research that name and buy his books. He's got a couple of good books. The late Dr. Richard Twiss, he's a Sakanju Lakota from Rosebud in South Dakota. And he was speaking at a conference. I didn't know him at all. It was 1997. I was on the worship team, leading the worship team, and I had all these Native people with me. And we got up and we were singing the Christian top 20 stuff, right? I don't know what it was. It would have been at the time. It would have been Chris Tomlin or whatever. But we were just singing. And I was really proud of my team because we worked hard and we'd practiced a lot and we sounded really good. Like, we were pretty awesome, I have to say. And so, I'm the most humble person I know. But no, I was so proud of my team too. So then we sit down and Richard goes, "Hey guys, that was pretty good." And I had even a couple elders on my team, and one of them was a really great drummer, or is a really great drummer still. So he says, "Good job," and I'm kind of like, "We know," but okay, I'm making this sound much more worse than it was. But he goes, "That was really great worship, but." And now, if you're a worship leader and you hear those words, what are you going to do, right? I was just like, oh, sucker punched. And he said, "I wish our Native people would write their own songs." And that's all I heard. I just saw red, and I was like, the whole rest of the sermon, I didn't hear anything. I was just so mad at him. He's 6'4", so I couldn't really do anything about it. But my kids were just little then. Now they're in their mid-20s, and I remember thinking, okay, we'll show him. So we went and I stole some words from God, Joel 2, and we arranged some music, and we come back later on that night or afternoon or whatever it was, and I said, "Hey, we wrote a song." And he's like, "What?" So we sing this song, and afterwards he gets up to speak, and he goes, and of course we're just using guitars and stuff, and he said, that was really good. You guys wrote a song that's amazing. But, and it was like, what do we have to do? And he said, "I wish our Native people would write their own songs in our language, with our instruments, with our cultural ways, and as ourselves." And then it just sort of washed over me, and I was like, oh my goodness. And then I went home, and those words changed the course of my life. I had never used a hand drum before that. I had never used a rattle. I used a tambourine in the church because that was our version of, we had rallies and stuff when there's a lot of Native people when I was growing up. They all sounded like Southern Americans when they would preach. Do you guys ever have that around here? And like way up in northern Canada, they'd be like, and we're like, whoa, there's a southern drawl coming out of that preacher. That's my cousin. I didn't know he had a southern drawl. But that's how we would preach, because that was what we saw on TBN, and that was how you did it, right? We were being colonized, constantly colonized. And and in my lifetime, I'm an example of decolonizing myself. It's been a process that's been going on, I think, my whole life, if I'm really honest. As a little kid, I have memories of being like, that doesn't seem right, but not knowing and not having any power to do anything about it. But Richard, those words, like I said, changed the course of my life. And I think that he is kind of like our Martin Luther. The great contextualization is what I started calling it, not the Great Reformation, because essentially they wrestled the Bible, the gospel, from empire. The church had become an empire, a corrupt, they controlled the language, they controlled everything. And Martin Luther and a bunch of different reformers, you guys know the story, they wrestled the gospel, they wrestled the Bible back. And I think that Richard was one of the ones that helped all of us to kind of do that. So we're all still doing that. I don't know that we're doing it. There's pockets all over North America where we're doing our best.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you both. So each of you've led in a number of contexts. Pastor, singer-songwriter, we've begun to hear about those. And I wonder if there are other examples of decisions that you've had to make along the way, decisions where you've had to or felt compelled to say yes. Even the decision to respond to Richard by saying, yes, we will use those instruments is a yes. It's a response to kind of a vocational call. Mm-hmm. And then are there any moments where you've, for any number of reasons, said no? And I want to just lift up, as you're reflecting on that question, what for me was a very moving example in worship yesterday morning. I was in the service where David Bailey was leading us in prayer. And David prayed very specifically for God to intervene, because Super Bowl Sunday is the Sunday of the greatest human trafficking in Atlanta. And I thought, David, what a gift that you named that so directly, so specifically. And I'm thinking, now, that's a decision you make as a leader to respond to culture, even by what you name in prayer. I found it very moving. But then don't all of us have decisions all the time? What will we name specifically in prayer or not? Which instruments or rhythms or songs, or we are making these kinds of decisions about culture, about sharing across cultures all the time. And by my way of thinking, we need the most help we could possibly get. And so I'm just wondering if you could take us into kind of your worlds of decision making along the way.
My specialty is education. Before I was a pastor, I also in theology. And in education, you are either child-centered or teacher-centered. And the old style was always teacher-centered. Like, I know everything, I'm going to teach you. The shift in education is that we are child-centered. We rotate around. And I was thinking this term about worship. Sometimes worship is centered around the leadership, the pastor, the people, instead of having it pew-centered, people in the pews, what speaks to them. And this is where, because I work with young people, they could go to church, but they don't feel like they have worshipped, because we did not mention where they are, We were so overwhelmed with where we are. And it takes this humbleness and working together to see where people are and to be able to speak together their language. For example, if you come to our youth meetings, they're totally different than worship on Sunday. Because, for example, we use Middle Eastern music. One other thing, as Reformed, we worship from our necks up, neck up, you know. This is what, you know, this is how we worship, you know. You know, and you, especially in the Middle East, I mean, we like to look, I cannot speak without using my hands and moving. But when you're in church, you become sound and proper. You don't move your hands. And it's like we have different cultures, you know, in this one. Today, I was in the worship service with the Stones, you know, the sermon, the way it was wrapped about that, the movement of the young people. It was so powerful. When we move our bodies, there's a stronger expression of worship. And I think as a church, you know, I tried with the young people to include that. And not to keep it with the youth meeting, but let it move into our, you know, official worship services. I think this is a decision that I've taken, and it's something that I know sometimes people don't feel comfortable with it, but we need to move into a different place. Another thing that I have learned from my brothers and sisters, other churches, you know, in my church, if there is silence, we become restless. We're not used to sit in silence. It's like we feel like, when is the next prayer, or what, somebody should do something. I believe we are challenged to sit in silence in God's presence. Especially because I come from an area. When you hear the pain of people, sometimes the best thing is to be silent. Because you don't have the words to express the pain, you know, and to allow God to speak in that. I've taken this decision to share these stories, you know, and to have people share their stories, and then we stand in silence in front of God to teach us how to speak. Because sometimes you feel, sometimes we start to speak naive things in the church. And we need to mind our language about the depth, especially when you are in front of pain, you know, to say something really meaningful. And if we cannot speak something meaningful, it's better to stay silent. And so the silence, I incorporated this. Another challenge that we have all in worship is the depth of what we are teaching. Because one of the temptations, we are blessed with media. We are blessed that we are we have access to the library of the word. But there is a risk that sometimes we lose the depth of what's happening in worship. So taking the decision, because I know some young people will be preparing a service and they've found something on YouTube, or, you know, they just put it together. But at the end, what did we learn, you know, from that worship service? To keep this, you know, identity is very important as well. At the end, you know, I go to church to hear a new message through the Bible. I want the Bible to speak in my life. I will do it differently. I don't do it in preaching. But this depth element is very important, because people come they're searching for something. And they need to hear a new message that's done through worship in this one. Stories. I believe the most powerful part of worship are stories. You know, my style of preaching, I'm a student of Tom Long. And he taught me how valuable stories are in preaching, you know. How when your story speaks to me, it just changes me. I mean, the power of stories in this. And to have the right story in the right place in our preaching, you know, in our sharing, and to be courageous to hear new stories from outside. You know, the stories of the refugee child who's struggling because he woke up and did not find his mother and father. To hear these stories, you know, and then we feel like we're sitting on a table owned by God. Let no one of us think that they own the table of worship. We do the preparation. We do the preparation to let God speak to us, and to have these stories, you know, sitting around and saying, Lord, how can I be the church of today? What's the good news? How can I really reach out in that.
Oh, I like hearing from you. My goodness. Can you be my new best friend, please? I so love it. Oh, so powerful. None of us own the table of worship. I think talking about being countercultural, as an Indigenous person, I think our culture has been picked apart by theologians and anthropologists and politicians and everybody for 500 years, depending on where you're at in Canada, the United States, right? We have everybody right away. Christopher Columbus is writing about Indigenous people, so I think that it's not my role anymore to be like, I need to really think about this, and I know that's not what you're saying, but in my context. But my context is more, I find myself in two roles. One of them is just kind of being a bit of a shield to Indigenous people. And when I walk into a place, I often say to people, you can ask me anything. You can ask me like, I heard Indians don't pay taxes, and it's not said, that's never said, that sentence is never said as, I kind of heard. It's always said with this dark edge behind it of, freeloaders, drain on the economy. That's what's behind it, right? So there's always that kind of thing. And I want to make a safe place for people to ask those questions. And then I can say stuff like, we pay a lot of taxes. And yeah, we have title and rights on our land. That's part of treaty. You are all treaty people. Right now we're on the Peoria and the Odawa land, Indigenous. Did I say that right? I don't know. I'm not even sure because when we go... And Potawatomi. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. Casey Church. How do you say the first one? Peoria. Okay. Yeah, and the Odawa. Did I say that? I said the second one. Okay, good. Awesome. Thank you for the correction. See, so when we go back to our original languages, it's important also to try to learn whose land you're on. But so my part, like I was saying, the first thing that I do is I try to act as a bit of a shield. Every place that I walk into, I feel like if I can raise the awareness just a little bit, if I can turning the thermostat switch, I can turn it one way or the other, and you're either going to put your jacket on or you're going to take your jacket off. I'm going to change something in the room just by that. So a little bit of information on Indigenous people. And my life being changed by sitting with amazing panelists these last few days, right? So that is more my role. I find myself just sort of being a bit protective of, folks. And if there's questions of cultural thing, I'll be like, no. You don't get to ask that question of us. You don't get to any longer say, well, we're not sure about this cultural practice. We don't think this should, this is not Christian. And I'm like, stop. You're not the one that's allowed to say that. Only the people, even I'm not allowed to say that about, the people here. I wouldn't dare because I don't know anything about them. If I can't even pronounce their nation's name, how on earth could I, give them any kind of help? I can walk alongside. I can ask some questions, but it's ultimately up to them. And I think that as an Indigenous person, erring on the side of grace is going to get me a lot further down the road. And I don't even really want to go to a lot of Native churches because a lot of times they'll have accepted, like a lot of folks in our churches, unfortunately, will have accepted a lot of the things that the white church has said is evil and wrong, and so they'll end up looking and sounding exactly like, like Richard Twist said, if you were blindfolded and you walked into a Spanish church, you would hear Spanish language and you would know exactly where you were. And he said when you walk into a Native church, you just would think you're in a cowboy church because the music is like country music and stuff. And he was right. There's no now it's different in some places, of course, it's different, but The other thing that I find myself doing is a little bit of a cultural interpreter, and that's not walking alongside and saying what is right and what is good and what is orthodox and what, which baby and bathwater do we throw out of this place. That's not my role. Rather, my role is to say, here's where you have kind of messed up American church and Canadian church. And so in that way, I find myself much more countercultural, where I find, and if you have you guys heard Mark Charles speak? Any of you, you're still in pain a little bit from that, I'm thinking. It's painful listening to what he has to say. It's like a lot of truth that he gives it in, and it's fast, it's accurate. He's got slides. I don't ever do slides. But that is more where my countercultural, where I'll kind of go on the attack. Because when people talk about Indigenous communities as being dark, Indigenous people, or culture, songs, whatever, even language, we were punished in residential schools, beaten for speaking the language. So taking those things back is a priority for me, and saying, and I tell stories like. I love that you said stories, because I just think stories are such a gift. And people will be like, who are you? And I'll be like, and then I'll tell a story. Oh, I remember you. They remember the story, right? So that's fine. Remember the story. But I tell people, we all, every day we make cultural, we walk into cultural situations, and some of them we don't even think about. When it comes to a native situation, everybody will lose their mind, right? Because if I pulled out a sage bowl and lit some sage and said, we're going to have a smudge ceremony, some people would get up and walk out. And it's happened in churches. And it actually, when you light the sage and there's smoke coming up, we always say it'll get rid of evil spirits. So when those people walked out of the church, I wanted to say, hey, it worked. But one of the things you'll do is you can walk into an Asian restaurant, and you will walk right past the statue of Buddha. You'll walk right past some incense and orange and a little Hello Kitty. You can walk right past those things, and me too. Nothing's going to get in between me and my sweet and sour pork. I say that everywhere. Nobody has yet brought me sweet and sour pork after that talked. I don't know. I keep throwing these hints out. But nobody's going to, but nothing jumps on me. Nothing attaches itself to me. How does that happen? Well, it's theology, summarized in one sentence by this: Jesus has it covered. Jesus has us covered. And where we go into situations where there might be something of a spirit, there might be something of a prayer that was said, I don't know. I tend to think that people have... I don't know. My theology has changed the older I've gotten. You're supposed to get more conservative. I don't know what's happening to me. But I kind of feel like I can walk alongside anybody. It doesn't matter where they're from, what they're doing, what they believe. I used to be very sort of like, vigilant about my theology, and they have to fit into my theology, or else they're not really a Christian. And if they're from another religion, then, oh my goodness, you're screwed. And if only you were more like me. So hopefully this was me early. Okay, there's maybe a couple of times in my life. I'm so ashamed. But the decolonization process of love people, walk alongside of people, and so that, why is that countercultural in the church, right?
We want to thank you both for taking us into your world for these. I think one of my prayers is that today's conversation has been seed planting, and that the fruits of our reflections will not end when we walk out of this door, that they have just begun. But I do want to ask, in the few minutes we have left, if there are specific resources you would recommend for us to continue our learning. So Richard Twist would be an example. I've mentioned this Nairobi statement. On the Worship Institute website, you will now find a growing, robust collection of resources related to this theme, and this conversation will become a part of that. a kind of ever-growing set of stories that we pray over time will do powerful work. So it's not just a single conversation, but it's a part of really a way of life over time. What else would you have to recommend to us to continue our learning and growth?
Well, I think as World Community of Reformed Churches, we have material on worship that I think is one of the valuable material. If you read Arabic, I can recommend for you other things, but you have to work on your Arabic for that. So this is mainly really, most of the resources I use are from the West in general, that most of you might know. I don't have anything new specific that I have now in English from our side, because most of the material is in Arabic.
One of the writers that inspired Richard and quite a few others was a man named Vine Deloria Jr. He wrote a couple of books that I've read. One is called God is Red, and another one with a really boring title. That's Custard Died for Your Sins. It's tough saying those. It's tough saying all this stuff. It's tough, but it's good. It's a good read. It's tough to read these books because he will challenge your Christianity. He will challenge some of the foundations of, just like Mark Charles, right? You know, it's the founding of America. Are we a Christian nation? Is Canada a Christian nation? From an Indigenous perspective, the answer is no. So, yeah, so those are some good reads.
What's the name of the second one?
Custard Died for Your Sins. And Richard's book is, his first book is One Church, Many Tribes. And we used to tease him, and we would say the name of his book. We'd introduce him as the author of Many Indians, One Hairdo, because we all have long black. He would be like, oh, yeah, kill Richard. I miss picking on him.
Will you please join me in thanking our panelists today? Najla, Cheryl, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming. God bless.